Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you here. Today we are looking at some of the most difficult words that Jesus challenges his disciples with. To love your enemies. And you have to start with the question, can't we all just get along, right? You know, we think of all the relationships we have, and we have great friendships. We think that that's just about as good as it can get. But we know that even in our closest friendships, we have tips, right? Sometimes you don't get along with those people that you care about. Statistically, domestic violence is the place where you're going to find the greatest opportunities or the greatest statistics for the number of violence happens between people who actually know each other. You think we know each other, you should love each other, right? But no, it seems like the more we know each other, the more we find fault and the more we find difficulty in getting along. Statistics would tell us that 1 out of every 4 women encounters domestic violence in our lives, and that every day, this is hard to believe, but every day there's 3 women and 1 man who are killed in domestic violence. Every day. That's horrendous. But we recognize that there needs to be something that changes. There needs to be some transformation in our hearts and our lives to affect this kind of thing. And Jesus really hits at the heart of it. And these words that we read this morning where Jesus says, if somebody strikes you on the cheek, turn the other one, are really the core pieces of what Jesus is telling his disciples about the new way of living as believers in Christ. There needs to be some transformation in the way we act, and how more core to that than the way we interact with other people. Now, I know that this church is full of loving people, and we don't have any difficult to deal with people here, right? But all of us at some point in our life might meet some people that we find a difficult time in getting along with. And Jesus has some words for us on how we can work through some of these difficult relationships, and I want to share with you some of that today. So, first thing that Jesus points out is, he says, you've heard it said in the past, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And this statement is quoted again by Moses. It starts with King Hammurabi and his general code. And you can imagine that this quote is from 2,000 years before Christ. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Now, the invention of having a law that provides for an equal response to some injury to a person was new. Could you imagine a society where there was no law whatsoever? What would happen is that perhaps in an argument, perhaps over playing cards or something, somebody hit another person. Well, that person now has to repay that insult, and so they then break the other person's arm. And that other person then hits the person back, and it goes back and forth. And now if one person dies, now what happens is the next family member of the injured party goes after that individual. Now, if that individual dies, then you got the entire family going against this person. Next thing you end up with 2 tribes at war with one another. Escalation from small things, and trying to find some way to limit the extent to which personal injury affects the society. Hammurabi came up with this great idea. Just simply look at the situation. The punishment should meet the crime. Exactly. And so he says, for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Let's look at exactly what happened, so that there is a limit to the scope of revenge. So we end that cycle of violence. And it provided mercy, so that an individual who committed a small crime doesn't have to worry about the family coming after them and killing them because they made a small crime. So it limits this and provides some mercy. It also provides for a measured response, because eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is actually not to be taken literally. There was no judge out there with a pair of forceps waiting to take people's teeth. That was just not the case. And in Jewish law, they recognize that it's not fair to take somebody's good eye in replacement for an eye that's already damaged. And so there was nobody out there waiting for a literal translation of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But rather they came up with a whole system of compensation for damages. So that if somebody had an injury, there might be compensation. If this person was placed on a scale, and so this person was healthy, and now after the injury, this is the result, what is the net difference? And how many shekels would it take to compensate for that difference? And so there was a whole system of figuring out how to compensate exactly, an eye for an eye or a shekel for an shekel, to make sure that they were equaled out. Now, this, of course, is a measured response, and that's basically, in America, that's how our whole system of compensation is worked out. Although sometimes we look at some of the response, we look at some of the awards to damages, and we think, that's a little bit off bounds sometimes as we see these things. And sometimes people do some really foolish things. This last week in our Tuesday morning class, we were talking about this, And somebody mentioned that there was a case in Texas where somebody, or not in Texas, we recognize it couldn't happen in Texas, but this guy broke into somebody's house. See, this is why we knew it couldn't happen in Texas. Somebody broke into somebody's house, got locked into their garage, couldn't get out. And because they couldn't get out, the person who was the house owner was sued for damages for the individual who was locked into their garage. We think about disproportional justice in some ways. But Jesus recognizes in His words that we have to go much deeper than simply just eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. There has to be some end to the cycle of violence. There has to be something at play to change this ongoing, suing, litigious response to an issue. And Jesus goes on to say, "But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If somebody wants to sue you and take your coat, you should give them your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, you should also then go the second one." Sort of the buy one, get one free thing. Now, some Christians have through the centuries really taken what Jesus said literally. In fact, Martin Luther describes this eccentric saint who he met who had lice. And he said he would do nothing to remove the lice from his body because he said, Jesus says, we should not resist evil. That was crazy. And Martin Luther would point out that that's not the case. Jesus doesn't give these commandments in order for us as Christians to be passive, just to be the doormats for the rest of the world to walk on. That's not what he says. And the reason we know that Jesus is saying this is because we see the example of Jesus. In His own life, Jesus continued to talk to the administration, He talked to the powers that be, that when they were oppressing others, Jesus made sure that they knew that they were not to do that. Particularly with the Pharisees, when He saw their treatment of the poor, the widows, the outcasts. Jesus' strongest and harshest words for the religious elite, those who had the power in order to transform and change society, was for them to change. Now, if Jesus was intending for everyone to just be passive and be a doormat, He would have let it all go. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus' harshest and most transforming words were for the Pharisees that they would change their action, change their attitudes. And also when we see that there is evil going on, Jesus doesn't just sit by idly waiting for it to happen. When He saw evil happening in the temple courtyard, when people were exchanging money for goods and they were making a profit off the poor, Jesus stepped in and in anger turned over the courts and set the animals free. What we see in the example of Jesus is that Jesus is being consistent with a bigger principle, and that is the principle of love. That we are to act not out of a litigious right for right, wrong for wrong kind of concept, but rather we're supposed to act out of love for one another. So how do we then make sense of what He has said? Turn one cheek to the other. Well, essentially, these are all pieces of how we might experience difficult people in our lives. Right? And difficult people take something from us in these different examples that Jesus gives. In the first, when He says, turn the other cheek, for somebody to be struck in the left cheek, they actually had to be hit with the backside of the right hand. Right? And this backhanded slap is an insult. It's really not just about a physical assault, it's about insult. And it's basically saying, off with your face. I take your face from society. Right? I'm taking away your pride, taking away your integrity. That's what the meaning is behind this. And so it says if somebody is to take or to come after your pride and your integrity, you just turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek. Secondly, he says if somebody is asking for your cloak, to give them, or ask for your coat, to give them your cloak as well. In Jesus' day, there were often two layers of clothing. You had your inner garment that you wore, and most people had at least one set of inner garments. And he says, those inner garments, those were the ones you would change off. You'd take them to the laundromat, right? You'd get those clean. But your outer coat, or your outer cloak, this was the garment that you would have as your main garment. You only had one. And that was the garment you might even sleep with. It was used as a blanket as well as your covering. And Jesus says that if somebody's coming after your inner garment, then you should be able to be willing to lose also your outer garment. Be able to give it to them. Now these sum up probably the hardest commandments that Jesus gives for Christians. And how is it that we need to be willing to lose our pride as well as our possessions in light of evil that's coming against us? Well, Jesus, of course, has pointed something that's bigger than just the surface tension. It's not just about the outward possessions that we own. But in the whole piece of the Sermon on the Mount, in the section that we're getting on, Jesus is talking about an attitude of the heart. He's saying we recognize that God is the one who provides for all of our needs. God is the one who sees us, who knows what happens in secret. God knows your integrity. God knows your character. That we need to trust God for these things. And rather than allow for the world to make their judgment or their statements as to whether or not we have or we don't have, we must trust God for those first and foremost. There's this interesting story about a student in China who had come to Christ. And he was praying for his student body, praying for the university, that his friends might come to know Christ. But he knew that it was not lawful for him to speak openly outside of his room with persons who asked him questions about who Christ was. But one day he came to a class, and it was the start of a new quarter, and it was a philosophy class. And one of his professors wanted to make a point about how weak Christians were. And so he said, if anyone here declares to be a Christian, come forward. And of a room of over 1,000 students, one student stood up and came forward to the professor. As the student came forward, the professor said, I want to see if you're going to live out the character that Christ asks of those who believe. And so the professor smacked him across the face. And he said, I'm waiting. What does Jesus tell you to do? And the student turned his cheek the other way. Again, the professor hit him in the cheek. Now this is a shame-based culture. Smacking somebody in the face is really losing face in that culture. Then the professor did something. He said, now give me your jacket. And the student took off his outer coat. And he says, now what does Jesus tell you to do? And I'm waiting. Now the student who was mindful of the other students said, now to my other students, I don't want to embarrass anybody. So if you don't want to see, close your eyes. And he takes off his clothes, and he gives them to the professor. Now, with tears streaming down his face, the student runs out of the class. And the professor goes on to say how weak Christianity is, how low this ethic is, because it deprived this man of his coat, and it deprived him of his pride. But then something amazing happened for that student. In the next few days, the next few weeks, in the next month, students after student came to his room and said, I want to know more about this Jesus. Because obviously there's something different about you. There's something new that I need to know about. Something that gives you the strength to be able to face the ridicule. Something that gives you an inner strength that is able to endure even in the face of loss of integrity. I want to know that man. I want to know that Jesus who is able to make that change in your life. Tell me about it. And through his testimony, over 50 students that quarter came to Christ and began a new student movement within China. Amazing transformation. And Jesus comments, he further goes to say, if one person asks you to go 1 mile, to go 2. Now in Jesus' day, it was common, and it came from the Roman government, that if a Roman soldier was carrying something, and he wanted to have one of the citizens of the area to carry his baggage for him, he would simply take his spear from his shoulder and put it on your shoulder. Now that meant that you are now his servant for 1 mile. And you were entitled. You then had to pick up the Roman soldier's stuff and walk with him for 1 Roman mile, which is essentially about 1 kilometer in distance. And then, of course, then the Roman might pick up another person to take it for another mile. And it was compulsory. It was a sense of servitude that the Romans had imparted upon other non-Roman citizens. Now, of course, the Israelites hated this. You know, could you imagine you're out there shopping, you're doing your thing, you've got your tomatoes or carrots or whatever else, and next thing you know, you've got a Roman spear on your shoulder, and you've got to walk 1 mile for the Roman citizen. Completely out of your schedule, right? I've got to be somewhere, I've got my MOPS group at 3 o'clock, right? And now I've got to take this stuff for the Roman citizen an extra mile. Well, Jesus says, if you are asked to go 1 mile, go 2. And this is actually what happened to Simon of Cyrene. When Jesus is carrying the cross up to Golgotha, one of the bystanders, the soldier picks him on the shoulder, right? Just taps him on the shoulder with the spear and says, now you're going to carry the cross for Jesus to Golgotha. And finally, we hear the statement Jesus says, if somebody begs of you money or asks to borrow money, you should give generously. Wow, you should give generously with what is asked. And this is coming from Deuteronomy 15, because we know in the Old Testament there is ongoing statement about how we're supposed to care for the poor. But in this section, we hear these words from Moses. He says, if anyone is poor among you, of your people, at any time, in the land the Lord your God is going to give to you this land, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought, that in that year of Jubilee I will be released from this obligation. But rather, give generously to them and do without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to. He will bless you. There will always be poor among you in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards those of your people who are poor and needy in the land that the Lord will bless you with. What's interesting is we see throughout Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament, is that God places into society the poor among us. And we see that that's actually an action of God, because we see that God has said, there will always be poor in your land. God has sort of provided in the same way that there will be milk and honey in the Promised Land. He said, in that same way, I'm going to provide poor into your land. You're thinking, that's just the weirdest thing ever. But God does this because God is intending to test the hearts of His people. And in other places, particularly in the prophets, it says, because you did not care for the poor, because you did not care for the widow, God is going to remove you from the land that He has given to you. Essentially, God uses the poor among us as a test to see where is the condition of our heart. Are we willing to care for those whom God has brought alongside of us? And believe it or not, God is looking. God is watching. Now, that is the whole point of these attitudes that Jesus is asking, is are we looking to God who is going to provide for our needs, or are we going to look only to our own resources? Are we going to be litigious with each other, or are we going to trust God for these things? We also recognize that Jesus is saying that none of these things are passive. None of these things are passive, but rather they require an intentional action on the heart and the action of the believer. I'm going to intentionally turn my cheek instead of run the other way. I'm going to intentionally withhold my fist from smashing the guy in the face, and I'm going to intentionally give him my other cheek. I am intentionally going to give somebody what they need and care about their condition rather than run away. All of these things require action, and none of them are passive. It requires a decision of your heart to be loving towards the other. And that again is that principle of love. To act in love towards one another, not in selfish self-regard. The devices of destruction in this way lose their strength. These devices of destruction of persons who are trying to cause us to lose pride, lose possession, lose our time, or lose our money, none of those things have control when we're willing to live in the atmosphere, in the condition of love and loving response. That whole cycle of violence finds an end as people live out the principle of love for one another. Now, Jesus is saying we are not to try to get even, but rather to seek out the other person's benefit. And the way I see this is really only possible if something has transformed in our life, if there's been a change in our heart. Because the natural condition of people is to immediately respond and getting even. That's a natural condition. That's who we are. But rather, it is only when we're able to place our trust in God as our guardian and our provider that our lives themselves are able to be transformed. And we're willing to take on the stronger position of acting positively in the face of destruction. We recognize that even as God is so good, we ourselves are not good until we're willing to trust God to be good for us. And once we've experienced the goodness of God, we're allowed to pass that goodness on to others. And that goodness transforms us, that we become an agent of change, an agent of care for others. We see that this is also pointing to the need for forgiveness. Because when we've been injured and we've been hurt, the only thing we want to do is find revenge. Find some way of making sense of the pain and the hurt and the destruction that has been caused to us. The evil that has been inflicted, we feel we need to inflict on others. But into that whole system, Jesus enters into the picture with forgiveness. Being able to say to the person who injured you, I forgive you. I forgive you. I let you free from the pain that has been caused to me. In that forgiveness, and only because of forgiveness, is healing actually possible. Only when we're able to forgive others is the other person able to then move on from the destruction that they themselves have caused. And that destruction continues to bind and become as a poison in a person's system until they are released. I like to use the illustration with the children that anger and frustration and sin are a lot like the monkey cage. And the monkey cage is actually a jar that is placed into the forest and is buried under the ground, and inside of it is placed a banana. And the monkey comes around and he sees the banana and he grabs hold of it. And as he grabs hold of the banana, he wants to go away. He gets the banana and he wants to get out. But he's not willing to let go of that banana. Now the longer he holds onto the banana, the more he is stuck. And it said that the monkey hunters just simply come around, put a net over the monkey, and take him away. Now, often what happens in our life when we've experienced pain, we grab onto that pain and we hold on to it, and we're not willing to let it go. Now, it doesn't even matter if we lose our house, we lose our possession, we lose our pride, we lose our time, we lose everything, we lose nights of sleep because of the pain and how much we think about how much we hate that individual, and it's like we're not willing to let go. Jesus wants us to end the cycle of violence. And the only way to endure and recognize the change is by letting go in forgiveness. And of course, we have to first be able to forgive ourselves of the pain that we have caused others, and also the pain that we have experienced, to recognize that as we've been victims, we can forgive ourselves. But as we recognize that we have truly been forgiven of all things by Christ, the one who went to the cross, the one who poured out His own life through His blood and His sacrifice for us, when we recognize that we have been forgiven, how are we then able to hold anything against another individual? We too are asked to let go. In that way, the transformation of the cross becomes complete, not only in the relationship we have with God, but in the relationship we have with others. Jesus is asking us to trust Him, to take a different way of living, to change that. Jesus says we are to love our enemies. There's this interesting story about an explorer of the New World by the name of Narvaez. Now, Narvaez, on his deathbed, was asked by a priest, "Have you forgiven your enemies?" And Narvaez, apparently, in a very quotable statement, said, "What do you mean, enemies? Any I had, I've shot." But Jesus also gives us some practical advice on how we can live out this idea of loving our enemies. And the first is, He says, we need to speak graciously. A gentle word turns away wrath. Proverbs 15:1. I don't know if you've ever had that occasion where you're in an argument, but somebody at the end said, "Peace." Just spoke any word that kind of changed the situation. Perhaps you even started an argument and the person said, "I'm not wanting to argue about this. I love you too much." A gentle word turns away wrath. Sometimes even a smile can turn away wrath. I know that I've seen situations where people walking down the street and they go, look at their face, they say, "Hey there, how are you?" And suddenly, the transformation happens. Jesus tells us we are to speak graciously to those who might harm us. And we are, secondly, He says, respond kindly. And the word for kindness that He says here is actually the word for beauty. Respond with beauty. Wow, what would that look like? The act of random kindness that we see around us. Jesus says we are to respond to difficult people by responding to their evil, to their destruction, with kindness, with beauty. And that can transform the situation. I know that responding, it's not always easy to respond with kind words or respond with kindness. One senator had a solution to all of his hate mail that he received, and essentially he put a note on there, and the note said this: "Dear sir, I want you to know that some lunatic is using your name and address. I wanted you to know." He put the note on their letter and sent it back to them. I'm not suggesting we do that, but we're supposed to find creative, beautiful ways to respond to persons, rather than in saying kind. Jesus also said we are supposed to pray for those who persecute us. Pray for them. We know that we do not know the ins and outs of a person's situation. If you'd walked a mile in that person's shoes, you might have done exactly the same thing that they had done. We don't know what happened. Maybe they woke up with a bad hair day. We don't know what happened that day. But Jesus invites us to pray. And in praying for another individual, it gets us outside of our own understanding of the situation and asks God, who knows all things, to be the one who blesses them. And that transforms our heart, because now we're able to let go of the pain and suffering that we've had and say, "God, this is yours. You do with it as you wish." And we pray not only for, as King David said, "Lord, that you will bring down wrath on my enemies." That's not the prayer that Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the type of prayer of asking for intercession. Lord, help me to understand how I can care for this individual. Bless this person's life. And pray for that relationship. Lord, help me to understand how I might interact differently with this individual. Constant prayer. Fourthly, he says this, we should act as agents of God. He says, just as God in heaven acts a certain way, so we should also act in this way. For me, as I hear those words, I recognize that this is where Jesus truly shows His divine character as the Son of God. Because He doesn't just give us good advice. He's just not telling us how we should live. He's saying, look to God. He is changing the whole paradigm, the whole rubric of how we live our lives by saying, we're not supposed to act as just people. We're supposed to act as God. We're supposed to act as God's agents towards one another. Just in the same way that God blesses those who are unrighteous and those who are righteous, just as He pours sunshine and rain on both, our actions are not supposed to be distinguished. We're supposed to be able to care generously and graciously to all persons. You know, we think of various characters through history. Abraham Lincoln, apparently appointed as his Secretary of War, somebody who continuously and vehemently spoke badly about him. Because he said, I know that this person is the best person for the job. And at his funeral, that individual came and said, Abraham Lincoln was perhaps the most gracious man who ever lived. There should be an example of our lives that shows people and a reflection of the character and the nature of God that is seen through us. If we are the children of God, then God should be seen in us, not only in our words, but our actions. Therefore, we are supposed to live differently as people of God, not just people of the world. And then finally, Jesus gives this command, and this is the last part. He says, be perfect, even as God in heaven is perfect. Now, as I read that, this is sort of the summary of the whole piece of the Beatitudes, and we finally throw up our hands and say, not me. I am not perfect. Is there anyone here who wants to claim that they're perfect? I know. Okay, so somebody says, I know somebody. There we go. But none of us is perfect. And I think that that really points to the main piece of what Jesus is saying in this. And that we are to live perfectly as God is perfect, but we know that we fail. And in that failure, we are open to God's grace. Because it is only by God's grace that we have been forgiven. It is only by God's grace that our condition of our heart for another person can be transformed. It is only because of looking to God that we're able to love our enemies. And none of these things can be done in our own strength. They can only be done as we trust and look to God to accomplish in us what we could not possibly accomplish in our own strength. And Jesus gives us that perfect example where He Himself went to the cross, endured all sorts of suffering, beatings, and insults by the Romans, by the governments, by the rulers, by the religious elite even. And finally, at the end, being put in the cross in the position of a criminal and put into a mass, to be killed. Now, Christ demonstrates for us our life. How we are supposed to be willing to live for God, regardless of our circumstance, that others might see God through us. Throughout the history, we have seen social change as a result of Christ's words. We look at this last century. Martin Luther King changed society because he lived out a demonstration of passive non-resistance. The Russian Revolution that happened in the 90s, that whole piece in the Red Square, was ended when the grandmothers put flowers into the muzzles of the tanks and said, would you shoot your mother? We see the transformation even in the last couple of years with the Egyptian Revolution and the whole Arab Spring, where peaceful revolution transformed governments. And now we've recognized that sometimes that hasn't always worked out. You know, the governments that take over aren't always the best ones. But we recognize that change does happen as we follow after Christ. Let's look at India with Gandhi, who is a great example of following the precepts, the examples of Christ. Even though he himself, as far as we know, never became a Christian, he said, I'm going to live out the words of Christ. And he gave us a great example of what that would look like. Even in the 4th century, there was a monk by the name of Telemachus who felt himself compelled by God to go to Rome. And he had no idea why God would compel him to go to Rome, but he put his stuff in a bag, put it over his shoulder, and went to Rome. When he went to Rome, he saw that the whole crowd, the whole city was moving into the Colosseum, and so he followed the crowd into the Colosseum. And there were 80,000 persons sitting in this Colosseum, and as he watched, he saw all sorts of persons come onto the stage, and they made a pledge to Caesar, saying, Hail Caesar, we give our lives for you. And they started to fight. And Telemachus famously walked into the center of the Colosseum, held out his hands to the gladiators, 2 giant gladiators, and said, "Stop! In the name of Christ, stop!" And at first, one of the gladiators hit him with a spear and threw him to the side. Telemachus stood up, walked back between the 2, and said, "In the name of Christ, stop!" The other gladiator speared him through the heart. Again, Telemachus stood up, and this is history. He stood up, and he said to the soldiers, he said, "Stop! In the name of Christ, stop!" It was said at that moment, Telemachus fell over dead. The gladiators looked at him, looked at each other, and put their swords down. That was marked as the very last day of the gladiator campaigns in Rome. Social change can happen if we're willing to trust God, if we're willing to place our lives in His hands, and to watch God at work, even in areas, in ways that we ourselves are unable to change. This, of course, requires a heart transformation, that we allow God to work within us in ways and in the depth of our heart, even beyond what we can understand. So I invite us to stand as we sing the song of response. Breathe on me, breath of God.